Okay, thank you all for coming today. My names are Ada and Adam, and my pronouns are they, them. I'm going to be talking to you all today about a series of art that I did over the summer. I'm going to chat about the project criteria that I was working with first, and then I'll show you some of my paintings and get into some of the ideas that I was working with through those. So a couple of months ago, I was part of a class with Natalie Wahlberger. She's a prof at OCADU. She's now the head of the Life Studies program. So congrats to her. And she asked us to create something that moved and then paint it. And this is what I came up with. At the time, I had just moved from Toronto to Cambridge to be with my parents during the pandemic. And I was really craving connection with place. I was also feeling very out of control. And instead of resisting that, I wanted to feel into it more, try and understand like all these confusing feelings that I was having with my life being kind of turned upside down. And at the same time, I was reading this wonderful book called The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Lauenhaupt-Singh. So I was getting interested in mushrooms. I was taking a lot of walks in the forest behind my parents' house. And I found out that yeasts and molds were also types of fungi. So they're decomposers. So in this little contraption, more or less, I brought together a bunch of things that were around me. I brought some moldy bread, some rotting leaves from the forest out back, some plant matter from my parents' garden, and also some active dry yeast. And that's what you can see bubbling here, is the yeast. I fed it some sugar so it would have something to eat. So yeah, how I was thinking about growth, how I was thinking about time, and how I was rethinking these things while observing this little fungal home. So I'm going to share a quote from that book that I mentioned, the Anna Singh book. Sorry, I need to. Okay, here we go. So this says, progress is embedded to and widely accepted assumptions of what it means to be human. Even when disguised through other terms, such as agency, consciousness, and intention, we learn over and over that humans are different from the rest of the living world because we look forward while other species, which live day to day, are thus dependent on us. As long as we imagine that humans are made through progress, non-humans are stuck within this imaginative framework too. And she goes on to say, without the driving beat of progress, we might notice other temporal patterns. Each living thing remakes the world through seasonal pulses of growth, lifetime reproductive patterns, and geographies of expansion. This is not simple empiricism in which the world invents its own categories. Instead, agnostic about where we are going, we might look for what has been ignored because it never fit the timeline of progress. So unless you're like an avid mushroom forager, fungal life patterns I find are largely ignored. So here's a very basic biology lesson for all of you. In the outdoors, fungi grow in an underground root-like system called mycelium. And then when the circumstances are just right, like when it rains, when there's moisture, and there's dead plant and animal matter to digest, the fungi fruits and decomposes the matter. And that's when we see mushrooms. and molds. In the Western zeitgeist, fungi are largely feared because of this association with death, but it's this death doula work that makes them so important. If there were no fungi, plants and animals would not be able to decompose, and we would be walking around on millennia of undigested matter, and the world would quite literally become unlivable. I call fungi my death doula sometimes because they teach me how to, quote unquote, die well. They show me that it's okay to let go of things that aren't working anymore. They show me that it's okay to let go of control, and that the situation will bloom by itself afterwards. So the second and last thing that I want to pull out of this quote and talk to you guys about are these seasonal pulses of growth that Anna Singh talks about. I really like how she shows that this idea of time really confronts widely accepted assumptions of progress. So instead of time being this strictly linear thing that is bringing us closer and closer to, I don't know, something like this big end goal, it shows that time is also cyclical, and experiences of time are relative. They're relative from person to person, and especially relative from species to species. So I made another fungal home here. You can see in the August photo, the yeast is quite alive. All of those bubbles were moving around. They're creating more air. And then in September, you can see the yeast has died. It's kind of left this creamy residue. But in the corner there is, is some moss that's still growing. So that was pretty cool. So I wanted to do another painting here. And I also became interested in books as a type of time making and world building technology. So I came up with this book. It's called Tangled Up and Full of Love. This is the first page here. I started with a very long piece of fabric that I painted, and I used that jar of fungi and dead matter as my model. And they kind of danced together. And over the course of, I think, 4 days, I painted it. And after that, I took the really long piece of fabric and folded it up accordion style. So the pages here kind of bleed into each other. They seep into each other in really fun ways as you kind of see different details of these fungi growing together. That's like a really big piece of mold there. And the really fun part about this book is that the back cover is another front cover. So when you finish reading it, you kind of flip it upside down and it's a whole other book. This side is called Earthy Afterlife, just how I think about fungi, really. It's kind of a like materialist, quite literal afterlife that's happening there. And then you read it the other way. And maybe you can see like different details, different patterns happening. So this aspect really plays with like the cyclical model of time that Anna Singh was talking about there. It's really tactile. I wish that I could be sharing, I wish I could be sharing it around the room, passing it around with all of you. Obviously I can't, but hopefully one day be able to do that. So I finished this book near the end of August, and ever since I've been taking a bit of a step back from painting again and just focusing on like going on nature walks, trying to identify and look at fungi, especially now in the fall. There's a lot more coming out. That's it from me. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'm really excited to hear what Lina and Max have to share.
So I'm going to be talking about wonderful Artland, which is one aspect of how my practice and life has shifted a little during COVID. Namely, I started this baby newsletter, and I'd like to give some insight on my thinking and my creative process behind it. But first, I think it's better if I maybe just familiarize you all with the actual content and structure of the newsletter. So I've only sent out 3 installments so far. And for the first one, I made these little comics that were easy to read on like a vertical scroll if you're reading on your phone or your computer. And they can be kind of loose and free form, combining like comics and text. And for the first one, I wanted to make it about some random thoughts that I had about painters and Mark Rothko. And this is a panel from the first newsletter. So it really just started out as a silly place where I could share my thoughts about art and culture, and sort of what I was thinking about or looking at in day-to-day life. And this panel reads, apparently Rothko dreaded his work to just be collected as nice decoration for rich people's dining rooms, which is what happened anyway. And this is me thinking about the painting in my mom's dining room that I think she got from Winners or HomeSense. That is kind of like a strange dark mirror of a Rothko painting. To give a bit of background, even before the pandemic hit, I was always the kind of person who had no problem holding up in my room without seeing anyone for weeks. I think for me and for a lot of other people as well, talking to new people feels like a balancing act. There's always a pressure to like do or say the right thing, and language begins to feel burdensome in some ways. And without the given context of being in the classroom, I generally find socialization nerve-wracking and kind of difficult to get into the swing of. I often found that I was exhausted by what were my own impotent attempts at articulation. And being a creature of comfort, the best way to circumvent this unpleasant feeling is by staying inside and just completely hermiting away altogether, which is maybe not a good habit, but something that has helped me immensely, especially when life feels heavy and uncertain, like right now, is writing in a journal. So here I can express my thoughts and feelings into anything from images to fragments of words to diagrams. It's an open field where I'm allowed to be ugly, stupid, desperate, repellent. And I'm saying this not necessarily because I want to purge these tendencies, but more to explore where they might be able to take me, where they're coming from, and to kind of entertain these things that nobody else cares about and to tempt them and see if they lead somewhere interesting. Most of the time they don't lead to anything interesting, and that's okay too. This journal entry, for example, I think I made in 2nd grade. It reads dial tone. Sigh. Goodbye, sun. Goodbye, star. Bye, moon. Bye, everyone in the whole world except for my #1 enemy, which is Chinese class. I don't think I appreciated community Chinese classes as much as I should have, but I think this is a good example of how you can use a journal. And it's basically how I use it still. What's best for me about using a journal is the freedom from conventional language, because I don't need to be understood by anyone. So full sentences are unnecessary. Logical ordering is unnecessary. And a journal is an experimental space that functions not so much as a linear record or linear timeline, but rather as a map where you can find pathways and you can find locations. And some people swear by daily journaling, but I typically only use it for periods of time when I feel lost or confused, or if there's something that I really need to work out. Another way of thinking about it is journaling feels like disassembling something in order to write the instructions for it. Even though it's not a tendency I'm proud of, being avoidant has figured into my practice and my general approach to art. So even while I'm extremely frustrated with the modes of real-time conversation, there is still a burning desire to communicate and to express, and to build up some kind of dialogue that might feel more spacious and less suffocating. And this is where narrative has figured into my work. It seems to make sense of our feelings and what we do, why we do what we do. We map out our lives onto these narratives. And for this reason, I enjoy making comics and zines that formulate my personal explorations in this sort of wild arena into something more cohesive or a collection of some kind. And that's one angle to look at this messy tangle of ideas. And I find that this helps me feel less stuck with my own insular thoughts. I like the freedom of the newsletter form because sometimes I feel like I need the narrative to come out a certain way depending on what I'm writing about. So for example, the second one I sent out was a response to racism and racial gaslighting in institutions that was brought into the open over the last couple of months, especially with illustration, which is the field that I'm familiar in. I'm currently in my thesis year of illustration, and there's been a lot of really messed up things happening in that industry. And I think that over the last few months, we've been feeling quite hurt and confused by what's going on globally, nationally in the context of Canada, but also locally within our communities. And I tried to use my journal as a place to explore my first instinct reactions, and then made a post trying to kind of articulate the connections and patterns that I and many other artists were seeing about how BIPOC and also specifically Black students were being treated in art school, and the tokenization and myriad barriers that are being faced. I think it's important to keep parts of your journal private, but I did want to show you guys how this page sort of laid the groundwork for this newsletter, and I'll just read it out to you. City council equals useless. Speaking candidly about illustration, I find it so disheartening that many Asians have bought into the idea of meritocracy, wherein the top echelon of merit is always defined by the rich and white. How can one being take up so much space and yet feel so small? Shame. I feel disappointed and ashamed. So this collection of thoughts seems random and unhelpful in many ways in terms of being like a public text. But it's important to, I think, work through these ideas and these first feelings that we have in response to what's going on in the world. And narratives and rescaffolding these thoughts into something more digestible can also explore the nuance of a really emotional response to something, I think. And that's kind of where the writing of the newsletter happens. And this is an excerpt of what I ended up writing for this newsletter. This is just a few paragraphs from the second installment in Rage and Paranoia. The accounts of anti-Black racism from SVA and other art schools remind me of the way I interface with the institution. Emotions range from approval seeking to paranoia to shame. What I mean by this is, I think of noticing white peers be consistently favored by instructors, as well as gaining more acclaim and leverage within the institution than their BIPOC counterparts, especially those who are Black and or first generation. Then immediately questioning my own judgment and instinctual perception. I am instantly flushed with the shame that comes with feeling spiteful. Should I be bothered by this perceived discrepancy, or is their work just better? Is there a pattern I'm noticing, or is it just a fluke? There is then a certain pressure to conform to what white instructors and peers expect from good work, which is easy to do because good work is quite homogeneous. It's clear these instructors, newer hires as well as people who have been working in the department for years, are overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly men. I don't have data on this, but trust me when I say this is true for the OCAD illustration department. It's not that I don't deeply appreciate or feel gratitude towards many of these professors, but you have to wonder why these people specifically have the tools and access to return to this institution to teach. It's at times like this when numbers on demographics are so helpful and validating to reference. But at the same time, not every microaggression or institutional oversight can be neatly summarized into a statistic. First, the system enacts quiet violence on its marginalized students via structural barriers, bigotry, dismissiveness, and passive lack of support. Then it makes us feel an ugly shame and guilt for feeling like we might be falling behind more than our more privileged counterparts for anything outside of our control. This is a familiar feedback loop of plummeting mental health, and this is what I mean by racial paranoia. You are always second guessing your interactions and feedback, positive or negative, well-intentioned or not. So this is just a brief excerpt from my post, but I was able, I think, to piece together multiple threads in a loose, albeit coherent way, which does feel quite liberating, and it is an easier avenue for me to talk about these things and have a conversation with people because I'm not necessarily trapped within oral dialogue. And the thing about newsletters is that they're self-published, so you don't really have to censor yourself and you don't need any funding to start one, which is really nice. So shifting gears a bit, I found that during quarantine, I had been attached to my phone more than usual, despite taking absolutely no pleasure in social media like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, because of like the low effort interactions that came with it. And I figured that if I was going to be communicating through the internet all the time, I wanted to generate output that was more meaningful. So many people are nostalgic for blogs, like Greta mentioned, the revival of Tumblr, and these social media platforms that supported more long-form content. And it seems that these quote-unquote blog mediums between professional corporate journalism and like a personal, super private Instagram profile, like these middle areas are few and far between, because sites of interaction between people in a more sustained manner online, like WordPress, MySpace, LiveJournal, DeviantArt, and like these other forums have sort of fallen off. And I do think people are trying not to get swallowed by this behemoth of social media, especially right now when we're spending so much time on our screens. So it did feel right for me to shift to something like a newsletter, which is unlike a publication in that it's native to the internet and also has the ability to update in real time, which is that connection that I think so many of us are seeking. And just to conclude this presentation, I think that creating small personal texts is really empowering because it's proof that we can convert like these mundane or messed up feelings that seem to come out of nowhere into something more coherent and more considered that can be shared with others. And I suppose that first and foremost, my practice emerges as a coping mechanism. So if you've also been having difficulty navigating virtual or physical social spaces, especially during the pandemic when so many of the rules have changed, I would highly recommend keeping a journal. And for those who already use a journal, it can be fun to generate some of those entries into longer collections or stories. When I'm in an uncertain state, sometimes I just really need a good story to anchor myself to. So I'm really excited to see where Wonderful Artland will go. And thank you so much for listening.
Hello, my name is Max. I am actually a student at Concordia University in film studies, so it's been great to be part of this and to see what the work that people are doing at OCAD. I'm going to get my presentation started, but before I go ahead, I just want to say thanks to Ada and Lina for having fantastic presentations, and Peter and Samin for doing a fantastic keynote of sorts, I guess we could call it, or the deconstructed keynote, as well as to Aggie and Greta and Karina for organizing a fantastic colloquium. Even if it's on Zoom, this is going off without a hitch. There's always a few glitches. We're fine. This is great. So thank you for having this today. It's great to be here. Give me one sec. I cannot multitask right now. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Good, cool, thank you. Okay, So my project is called Beyond the Green Microbe, the Finsta Digital Artist Residencies and Expanded Forms of Critical Discourse. Then kind of my subtitle, I would describe this as Art for Everyone During the Life and Times of Corona Pandemic. From Corona times, sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. I've never done an online thing like this before, so bear with me. But before I begin as well, I think it's important for me to acknowledge that Montreal is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanehaka Nation are recognized as the custodians of the lands and the waters in which I'm joining you from today, and Jojage is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples, and I respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within Montreal. So the way my presentation is going to go is that I'm going to kind of discuss the background of my project, go through a narrative arc, as this project is a series of Instagram posts with a narrative that's associated with it, talk to you a little bit about my process, and then in my conclusion, pose a question to my fellow panelists as well as to the speakers who are at the beginning, which we can maybe be part of generating the conversation that will follow after this. So again, my project is called Beyond the Green Microbe, the Finsta Digital Artist Residencies and Expanded Forms of Critical Discourse. And what I mean by that is the question of rethinking the green microbe. So what is the green microbe? It's a now all too ubiquitous visual icon of the pandemic and something in visual culture that we all know too well, but more so, I use that as a symbol to think about what's going on right now and how we're engaging with the pandemic and other social discourse that's around it. This project I launched on my Finsta, which is a second Instagram. And in speaking about journals, I would describe this as kind of a digital journal that I have open to a very specific audience, a group of close friends and family members to share my own musings. So early on in July 2020, tucked away behind the confines of my fake Instagram account, MTL Existentialist blog, emerged the @MTL Existentialist blog unpaid COVID-19 Instagram digital residency. This was a fictional narrative that questioned cultural institutions and their curatorial quests towards equitable, diverse, and inclusive futures. And no doubt these are important conversations, as we've discussed much today of, and really essential ones that we need to be having right now, and beyond that, essential action, which have become particularly heightened by the negative effects of the pandemic, its negative economic effects, and the resurgence of mainstream discourse around Black Lives Matter. So I want to make it clear that I'm not here to criticize any of that, and I'm not here to kind of uncover that, because I don't think that's particularly where my area should be and where my experience can come to talk about something like this. I believe in defunding the police and reimagining other violent systems and overhauling them for a better future. But what I'm going to do today is I want to look at those, particularly those who work in cultural institutions, who have cultural capital and hold power, and what they do in terms of the context of EDI and other initiatives that are similar, the problematics that come with that, such as tokenization and exploitative labor practices that happen for artists and cultural workers, and particularly something that's commonplace around BIPOC voices and queer voices when artists come to the table to work with institutions. So I think in the spirit of that, I think it's also important for me to situate my own identity within this. I am a cis, white, gay, Jewish man who is a settler and an uninvited guest on this land. And I think for this project, I've chosen to focus on the context of LGBTQ2S+ identity, because it is a group that I'm part of, but also a group that I have a very specific relationship to. And I think oftentimes a white gay man's identity is essentialized and seen by perhaps outsiders and people within the community as well as speaking to all experiences of queerness, which is just not the case. And I also know that I've had my own experiences benefiting from that and being kind of the gay that kind of fits diversity, fits those quotas, we're done, moving on, and no meaningful work is done. So I'm thinking about that in this context as well, because perhaps you've guessed it, this project is a satire, it is a joke, and I'm putting myself at the center of the joke because I am the joke in this project. So the residency project is a fictional narrative centered around a fabricated visual art gallery at MTL Existentialist blog. They're hosting a COVID-19 themed artist residency, and the purpose of this project again is to satire specifically COVID-19 curatorial practices and how they engage with virtual programming as a supplement for in-person experience and their intersections, broadly speaking, with social justice themes. The project, or the residency project, which is what I will refer to it for the rest of this presentation, is the form of a digital text and its 9 individual Instagram posts and accompanying stories that tell a serial narrative about an artist residency doomed for failure. So the project is my own experiment in creative and critical practices. It's a meta commentary that employs digital vocabulary to critique digital and cultural economies and their relationship to cultural institutions. And it's a form of research creation that's informed by a study of COVID-19 curation, cultural theory, and from personal experience. In my process, I explore the possibilities of producing a series of narrativized satirical memes and test Instagram's potential as a curatorial platform and a creative outlet for multimedia expression. This is a sandbox for an experimental practice and a site to share criticism to a small cultivated audience. So what I'm going to do for you for the rest of the presentation is share 4 case studies, or as I would like to describe them, 4 distinct plot points from the residency project's narrative arc. And just a note, I am going to read some of the text that accompanies these images, and I'm going to do so in a sardonic voice to characterize a fictional gallerist who runs the @MTL Existentialist blog gallery, or we could say artist run center if we really want to get there, but let's stick with the gallery for now. So without further ado, I would like to share with you the curator's statement, which I wrote on a grocery list in the iOS Notes app on my phone. This image that you're seeing right here is the second image that was produced in the series, and it essentially is supposed to act as a virtual wall text. And the text accompanies the post. The text that is accompanying the post image is the first thing I'm going to read to you, and it goes as this. Curator admin here, #residency update, curator's statement. With things to say, we're dedicating our residency in June to Pride Month. Diversity and inclusion is really important to us, and so is transparency, especially when we provide unpaid digital residency things. The art is coming soon, we promise, but not without a little context. So please read. And then I'm going to read this statement that you probably can see up on the screen that's peppered with tons of really fun emojis. Art is really important to us. We live in it, we breathe it, we are in it every day. COVID-19 is everywhere, literally. Like everywhere, microbe emoji. June is Pride Month. There are now a lot of gay people in the world. Pride flag, Pride rainbow, COVID-19 rainbow emoji. Diversity and inclusion. It's a hot topic. So in summary, the curator's statement is actually quite a long image burst. So the rest of it goes on to presenting equity and diversity and inclusion as a central theme in the project, and then talk transparently about the process, which fully admits to providing unpaid exposure and compensation for the artist's labor, and the topic, the theme of the residency being LGBTQ2S+ voices. But it also finishes with a disclaimer that states that Pride theme would be only happening in June, and it would be ludicrous for the gallery to focus on that beyond the month of June. And it's kind of funny because I actually made these posts in July, but we don't really have to talk about that too much. But all that to say, this is obviously a very powerful call to action. It's impactful, it's groundbreaking, and so much change comes out of the work that is produced, which is a good segue to my next slide. 2 gay microbes holding hands. So this is my second case study, and this is what I would describe as the original work that was produced during the residency project. So I also produced this work, if we can describe this as work. I'm not quite sure how to categorize everything. And this image is probably also from the back of a grocery list or some piece of scrap paper I found. And I decided to draw this up one afternoon, and my mom thought it was actually very cute, which I appreciate, but I was more so trying to go for a cynical joke. So all that to say is I was again trying to build off of this very kind of sloppy visual style. I went with a low quality photograph that I took on my phone, overused emojis, and in this statement, there's probably no proper punctuation, grammar, or spelling, or it's quite limited with how the copy is edited. So the text reads, #residency post, curator admin here. We're so excited to share the first work made during this residency, 2 gay microbes holding hands, ink on paper 2020. We asked the artist to reimagine, think about what inclusive microbes look like. Artist statement. I typically work on image-based practices, but sometimes I try other things. And I really think this drawing shows how I'm moving my creativity towards illustration and recentering the conceptual focus of my praxis. I still work subversively, and my work is subverting the microbe and diverting our thoughts to other places. However, what you will see later on is digital art, all focused on the manipulating of the image of the microbe and making us acutely aware of its spectral presence imprinted in our current realities. More to come, stay tuned. And so, as the residency progresses, the artist continues to create work at his most rapid pace yet. I wonder why there would be no pressure for an artist to create work for the sake of this, let's say, optics campaign. And he's slated for an artist talk. So it all sounds too good to be true. And it is, because we have some bad news. The artist is suing the gallery. So I'm going to go straight to the statement just to clear the air with the situation at hand. Residency announcement. Hello, everyone. Executive Director and Interim Chief Curator Admin here with a statement. Sorry, bad news. The artist talk slated for this afternoon will be canceled indefinitely, as the artist in residence, who will no longer be named, who is dead to us, has issued a cease and desist, claiming that we have used his work without his permissions and is now taking legal action. And we've had to fire all of our staff and rehire them all as unpaid interns and reallocate our limited resources towards hiring lawyers so that we can put an end to this smear campaign. More art to come though, don't worry. We're looking for a new artist in residence. And no, we will not be doing an open call. Thank you. Okay, so this takes an unexpected turn for the worse. Yes, this goes from being a playful artist residency that turns out to be a full-blown soap opera. So in the next slide, I'm gonna actually share with you the part of the story where the artist has an affair with a gallerist in New York. Okay, that's a bad joke. But all that to say, this is a part of the project that I would say where the joke started to wind down and I probably started to kill it itself, but didn't know how to end it. And we get to the next part of the saga that is called Stuck Doing This Stupid Ducking Residency Fuck. Here's another statement describing what the curators are trying to do to rectify this situation at hand. Residency update. Few important updates on the residency. Executive Director and Interim Chief Curator Admin here. We just lost our artist. He is suing us and lost funding. We also realized it is no longer June. Fuck. So we dropped the pride theme. July is dedicated to, I don't know, but we're just trying to connect with a really important artist. And not a lot of luck so far. Artists are a nightmare. Being a curator is hard. Holy fuck. Really bad day. Exploding head emoji. Papa needs to fix himself a stiff drink, a series of alcoholic drink emojis, and leave the office for the weekend. Wait, we're all working from home because it's a global pandemic. So that's why we got stuck doing this stupid ducking residency. Fuck. And that would bring me to the end of perhaps a performance that I have just done over Zoom. I'm not quite sure exactly what I did there, but the end of my summary of the 4 plot points for the Instagram post. So my question would be, what do we make of this? Which seems to be kind of a recurring theme from the conversation today. And yeah, I would describe this as perhaps a rather dramatic turn of events if this were to actually happen. And the residency evolves from a roaring success to an immense failure. So why did I put such intense amount of work for the sake of self-sabotage? And I did sort of ask questions about the status quo and even things that go against the grain that challenge status quo, like residencies for underrepresented artists. Are they doing more harm than good? Are they perpetuating practices or making meaningful change within their institutions? And as described by the gallery, the project provides an opportunity for an artist to create original work that addresses issues of diversity and inclusion. Yet a fundamental issue that lies at the core of the project that claims to overhaul established systems is that there's no monetary compensation for the artist in residence, which is a central aspect of the residency and an issue that's widespread outside of this fictional situation, that likely something like this or along the lines like this could happen. And that is to say, I too have known experiences where I've been in situations where I have not been paid for my labor, where I have been told that the money is coming and it doesn't come. And I have been told that asking questions around that are unnecessary and unproductive. So I'm including that in my commentary to also think beyond questions of basic artist labor, but questions about invisible labor, and what does it mean when someone who's bringing their experiences to the table, who's bringing more than just making art for the sake of a residency, how are they being compensated, but how are they being honored? Is it meaningful? And without adequate compensation, how can we sustain proper labor practices and in turn make structural change? So by including deliberate plot lines in the meme about this lack of remuneration, I show that despite the current economic crises, which have pushed pre-existing social inequalities over the edge, and no doubt put many artists at risk and cultural workers at risk, perhaps COVID-19 is still no deterrent for corporatized cultural institutions to perpetuate harmful labor practices. And I do this by discussing things like institutional culture, intern labor culture as a reference to hordes of unpaid cultural workers who participate in twisted rites of passage, where they're told their unpaid labor is a fair exchange for experience and credit on their CV that will one day be the catalyst into an eventual full-fledged career. I have purposely established this uneven aesthetic to present something that seems like a project that's ultimately just to create a larger audience and not to actually make meaningful change and belittling a political movement and the artists involved. And during the process, I asked myself questions like this. What is the role of the curator in eliciting social change and the artist in this? Is this project itself doing harm by parodying harmful practices, or is this making us think more thoughtfully about what's going on? Is this practice itself really even art? Is it a legitimate creative practice? I don't know, it's a meme, you tell me. And what is the role of humor, and how does it generate critical discourse? How can I expand my own practice as a writer through this? And can I liken the serial narrative to other forms of serial writing, like television miniseries or limited series and the novel? And is this a digital performance? And what does the platform, like Lina was saying, allow me to do with a narrative? But we need to think about paying labor beyond artwork and properly honoring someone for their work. But also in that context, perhaps what makes me as a gay man palatable to fit within something that's looking for diversity and inclusion. And I think finally, the final question I want to ask, I realize I'm running out of time, is that how can artists and curators meaningfully engage with digital platforms during the COVID-19 pandemic to enact forms of social change? So with that, I think it's probably a good time for me to finish off and pass it off to Greta when we'll go to the roundtable discussion. Thank you.